Yes.
I started the recording, but I'm going to.
Thank you, Nicole. So it's so nice. And it's interesting to see some of the folks that were part of that journey in my life here today. And I appreciate you coming out to hear this little talk. So I'm calling this Adventures in Papermaking. I'm going to focus primarily on what I've been doing here at the Morgan the last 3 weeks. But I'll give you a little bit of background as we move into that. Let's start with the proposal, which was submitted to the Morgan almost a year ago now. I think this is the time you're accepting entries again for the next year. And in my proposal, I sort of outlined two things about sort of what was my artistic journey, what is my artist story. I was trying to figure that out at the time. What makes me unique? What makes my work unique? Is something I think as artists we all consider and struggle with. And then the second part of that equation was, then what could I do with paper? Well, how can I use paper to help explore those ideas? I sort of encountered the Morgan. I've been working down here, or came down here actually to learn about Western papermaking. Nicole Donnelly taught a great workshop just before I submitted the proposal. And then I met Paula Dam through my wife, Sue, who kept talking about the Morgan and what a wonderful organization it was. So I put together a proposal, and I was thrilled when it was accepted. And then sort of started the clock ticking. And I had a lot of time to sort of figure out what I was going to do. And I did that in part by taking a lot of workshops. Eliza, who runs the workshop program here, does a wonderful job. I took workshops in Western papermaking, Eastern papermaking, pulp painting, deco box work, and just through a lot of different explorations. Sort of had a pretty good idea when I showed up here 3 weeks ago where I wanted to start with this residency. As a little bit of background, this is the only time I'm going to quote something, and I know it's a little long, but it just is going to sort of set the stage again for who I am and what I'm trying to do. So I've been thinking a lot about the intersections between my life and the art. I grew up in Paulding, which is a rural community of about 3,300 people in northwestern Ohio. The residents were by and large self-sufficient. We gardened, we canned, we tended to our home repairs. We made things like clothing, quilts, and crafts. We walked to work, we walked to school, to church, and to the homes of the friends and family. We looked in on our neighbors. We were ready to lend a hand when we were needed. And I left that childhood home then after completing an undergraduate degree, and I moved away. And I moved away, and this is what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and especially in this political environment. I moved away from that community geographically. I moved away from that community politically, and I think I moved away from that community religiously and spiritually as well. So now I'm using my artistic practice to sort of understand and think about that schism. I've had an interest in paper for a long time. As an undergraduate, I first did a series which I'd hoped to find a photo of, but couldn't, called Letters Never Sent. You know, when we go to college, we sort of start to deal with all that angst of who we are and what we did and who raised us and how they raised us and who our friends are. And so I made these 4 letters or 5 letters. And it's sort of an experience that your psychiatrist might have you do. You write out a letter to somebody telling them all the things you wanted to tell them, but you were afraid to tell them, and then you tear the letter up. Well, instead of totally tearing it up, I used sandpaper and all sorts of things and sort of destroyed the letters and then put them in lovely mats and behind glass. So there was the letter, the envelope, which was addressed, but they were unreadable by the time I had finished working. From that, I went into these 2 pieces, or this series of pieces. This is just an example of 2, where I was taking nice, thick, heavy rag paper that artists use. Many of these were ends of things I was working on otherwise. I tacked them with sandpaper. I tacked them with any sort of abrasive I could. And then I spray painted them, and I used fingernail polish and all sorts of things and layered these wonderful pieces of paper. I refer to these as hand-destroyed paper, meaning this is the opposite of hand-made paper. And a lot of fun. And I've really worked with this for a long time, and I've got a number of these works in my flat files. And then, as Nicole mentioned, when I went to graduate school, I sort of pilfered some tar paper, roofing paper from a construction site. It was a little small roll. It was just laying on the side. I think that was headed to the dumpster, but I carried it back to my studio and I tore it into strips and I wove these little sheets. And then I used those as a substrate for oil painting. So these are oil paintings. And then I've inscribed some words in there with pencils and I was drawing in there. with charcoal and other sorts of medium. This was a child's game, or sort of a riff on a child's game. Some little stencils that I had as a child of a camel, and it was called the Great Camel Race. And then from there, I moved to these larger pieces, these sort of figurative pieces, if you would. These are 6 feet tall. They leaned against the wall. 6 feet meaning they were sort of my size, so I could relate to them as another being, if you would. So this is just 1x2 boards. I nailed them together, and then I draped these tar paper sheets over them that I had woven together. And then I would cut the tar paper, and I started making all these wonderful sort of feathery designs. I apologize for the bad photography. We didn't have digital cameras back then in 1979. These are photos of photos at this point. But I mean, I started making these big figurative pieces, and then this all culminated in my graduate thesis show at the University of Colorado, where I made this giant sort of polyptych piece that was sort of based on an altarpiece, not sort of, actually based on an altarpiece. To give you a sense of scale, that centerpiece is a 4x8 foot panel. So it's a full sheet of masonite. And that's sort of the Madonna and Child. We have the saints on either side. We've got angels up above with all these wonderful feathers. Those feathers will come back into my work later. And I really designed this piece because I wanted to show on this wall in this gallery. And as a student, I knew that if I made a piece that could only go on that wall in that gallery, I would be the student who got it, and I sure did. And then the piece on the right there is just one sort of enlargement or detail of the larger piece. Again, you'll see some familiarities as we go along. So now let's fast forward. As Nicole mentioned, I see myself as a re-emerging artist. I completed the graduate degree and started managing a hotel, and managed a hotel for a while, and then found my way into nonprofit management and fundraising, where I had a really lovely career. But then when I retired, I decided now was the time to sort of use those 2 degrees that my father paid for and do something with them. And so now I tell people I stopped making money and now I make art. So I started by creating a studio space in my home. The 3rd floor of our home had a little bedroom suite with a bathroom and a bedroom, as many of the big Shaker Heights houses do. And in that closet were a couple of dresses from my wife, Sue, that were hanging there. And I thought, well, what better thing to draw than these 2 little dresses? And I found them interesting. You can see some familiarity with the graduate work I was doing, with sort of draping things over armatures. And I just found them interesting subjects. And really, it's probably the subject of a whole other talk. I told Sue the other day, I'm thinking about a talk called Jerry's Little Dresses, Cool, Cute, or Creepy. So stay tuned. Someday I'll give that talk. We're going to need at least an hour or an hour and a half to deal with it. But suffice it to say, these are my sunflowers. These are my haystacks. These are the subject that I, as an artist, really want to explore and to play with. And I've decided to do so for quite some time. From there, after I started drawing, I wanted to sort of return to my roots as a printmaker. My undergraduate degree, I left printmaking. I said, this is too time consuming. I don't have time for this. I want to paint, I want to draw, I want it to be immediate. And now in my old age, I've come back to printmaking, and I love that process. I love those carving of the blocks and running things through the press. So this is a piece that I did actually on Morgan paper, purchased from the store. Thank you, Celeste. And I think it's a Kozo Abaca blend, Abaca cotton blend, and it's a reduction woodblock print that I made on a little coat that I have. And then I decided I needed something that I could, a reduction woodblock print if you don't know the process, you carve, you print, you carve some more, you print, you carve some more, you print, and when you're done, you can't go back and start over again. So I decided I needed something where I could go back and revisit the same print using the different papers. So I created this little 4-block print. It's very small. So I used this as a subject. I created this paper in Nicole's Western making workshop. So I started printing on it. So I was printing on flax and cotton and abaca and bleached abaca and unbleached abaca and all these different fibers that I had made into paper. So I started this, and this was the first go around on a bunch of different papers to see how the different papers would react. And there's some examples here. You'll see the color changes depending on the paper. Certainly the brightness and the texture of the ink changes depending on the color. So there's a lot of things that shift as we go along. So I did that, and then I decided I needed a little bit more Western paper making. So I took Ryan's workshop in Western paper making, and I had this block in mind. So I actually had printed this block on some pellons, and I started exploring using some pulp paint. And I started inserting cheesecloth into the paper and things that I could do in creating of the paper with this particular print in mind, so I could take it back. And so I printed another series of the same block, a little different color, tried to keep the colors a little more transparent this time. I also had taken Eastern paper making with Michelle down here. And so I had this wonderful Kozo that I had pulled myself. And then I went back to visit my friend Celeste in the store. I bought a whole bunch more paper, but mainly Eastern paper that I could play with. And so I did another series of the same print. I actually, as the first part of this residency, I made another set of paper to come back and revisit this print again. Some of it is laying out here, some of it with pulp paint embedded in the paper, some with the cheesecloth embedded, but this time in the form of the dress rather than just a solid sheet, and some other with some sort of watermark type features that I'm going to experiment with. So then I thought, well, I need another block to experiment with, and I was actually sitting at a memorial service at Wade Memorial or Wade Chapel in Lakeview Cemetery, and if you've been there, those gorgeous mosaics on each side, and I just kept looking at these mosaics and looking at them, and then Africa and Byzantium was down at the art museum, and they had this wonderful mosaics in that show, and I thought, well, I'm going to make a mosaic woodblock. And so I drew it all out and I carved all these little tiles in my woodblock. And this is, again, a reduction woodblock. So I carved all the tiles, printed, and then I carved some of them out, print some more and carve some more out. This piece is called Piece by Piece. And these two are the identical printmaking process. So one's just on black and one's on white. They were printed at the same time, the exact same colors. And you can see how much the paper changed the color of these prints. And these were also printed from dark to light, which is the opposite of what you often do in reduction woodblock. Usually you start with your lighter colors and move to your darkers. So that was a fun experiment. Then I came and I visited Celeste again. This is a recurring theme, me and the store in here. I think I'm keeping the Morgan in business. And this time I was interested in in Kozo in particular, and Celeste reached in the bottom of a drawer and pulled out these little tiny shards of paper. And my first question was, why are these in the store? Why didn't they go into the recycle bin when they failed? And Celeste then looked at me with a straight face and said, you can buy these for $3 a piece. And Sue will tell you, I pulled out my credit card and I happily paid $3 a piece to buy these little shards of paper. And off I went to Zygote Press. And so I printed these at the same time I was doing the two you saw before, only this time I had taped these little shards onto a little registration tab that I could keep registered on the block. So those little tiny blocks would always hit the same. And I printed on these little tiny shards and I'd be carrying them across, and I had to tape them to another board because they would blow away. Once I printed them, I'd tape them down. So if anybody walked by, they wouldn't blow into the next room. So then I had these little shards, and then I took them and I used a process called chincolet, which is when you put a wheat paste on the back, you sprinkle it very lightly on the back of the paper, and then you put it on the paper that you're printing on ultimately. So this was a Reeve BFK paper, and I had printed these sort of color blocks and then put these tiny papers on top of that and embedded, and they're here that you can look at in person. So this was a series, there were 5 of them. I sort of arranged them as the piece got thinner and thinner and they started to fall apart. I put them in sort of in that order. The last piece here on the right is sort of an outlier. It was a little bigger piece, but separately. So that was an experiment, and this is going to come back into play with something that I've been working on here this week at the Morgan. So this is all prep for this residency. I got to get ready. I got to know what I want to do here. So then a happy accident. I signed up for a workshop and it got canceled at the last minute. I think it was the weekend, or just several days before. It wasn't long. And Liza said, "Don't worry, Nicole's going to do a one-day workshop in Pope painting to make up for it." So I came down, I took Nicole's one-day workshop in Pope painting. I was like, "Well, this is really cool. I'm a painter. I can paint with pulp." So we had this paper that wasn't fully formed yet. And I don't know that I'm not real good with the technical language, but then we're painting on it with pulp. And it's a very delicate process because if you paint too rough, and I'm a man and I like to shove things around, it'll just tear the paper apart as that brush strikes across the paper. So we painted this little, and this is a new theme or a different theme, not new to me, but my dead birds. I never see a dead bird on the sidewalk or the street that I don't take a photograph of it. And I have a collection of these dead birds on the street. Some people find, again, cool or creepy, that's the question. But this is a little robin that met its demise. And I did it in pulp painting. It was like, wow, that's a really kind of a cool thing. So something else, this was like a month before the residency, like, oh, here's something else I can explore. So I did a little bit of that here. I have to say, it was okay, you know. It didn't sing to me when I started trying to translate the dresses into the pulp paint, but I did a few little exercises there. And then right before the residency, Tom Balbo, the founder here, taught a course in decobox work, which is a process of, floating water and pulp in a box. You see that plastic, you pull that plastic out, you let the pulp settle onto the screen or onto your Pellon, and you form paper that way. And you can draw in this wonderful wet water, which is just wet water, isn't that redundant? You can draw in the water. And so I created this wonderful paper. Here you see it being formed, and then you see it starting to translate into a drawing. And I'm finding this is just a delightful drawing surface where that color gradation is part of the paper, but then I'm using vine charcoal and white pastel and sort of starting to mold that around and shift that. Something I'm really interested in. Then I started drawing my birds in the water. This was so wonderful when I learned you could draw with that pulp in the water, and the pulp's heavy enough that it doesn't move around too much if you're careful. And you'll see I had various moments of success. I will admit these have been cropped. These birds were ending up all over the paper because when I pulled that sheet out underneath, they and the first little bird, his head sort of went running off into an odd direction. The second one, I got a little better control of, and then the third one, I really felt happiest with. And here what I did was I started to put a little bit of pulp in that water around the bird so that the pulp wouldn't diffuse so much when I started to pull that screen out from underneath. Then I made some dresses using the same technique. And then I did these sort of ghost images that will become drawings. So going back to the drawing you saw just a few minutes ago, these are ghost images that I have very specific dresses, very specific drawings that I'm thinking about on top. Then I decided, well, I'm going to form these sheets into dresses. So I made some molds and I started pulling sheets in the form of dresses. These two will go together. That's a front and a back. They fit together. They hang on a little wire hanger. There's a little study in the back of the room. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for the people who aren't here today, but this is some molding. Next step, I decided, what if I took a piece of paper and I folded it to make it an dress? I had a dress at home that was basically just a piece of square, and it had been folded together and made into this cute little gown. So I made this is a little template for that. You can see that I'm experimenting with two different sleeve designs, but everything is on a single sheet of paper when it's formed. And then I have this process of folding it before it goes into the dry box. And so I put Pellon. Pellon is a fabric that's not paper, that the paper won't adhere to. So I put a little piece of Pellon under there so those sleeves will fold back and I can cut them. I put a piece of Pellon through the hem so I can pull that out and I can have a hem and a little ribbon that I can then, this is a paper ribbon, but I can pull the real ribbon through there and mold them into dresses, and they look something like this when they're all put together. Now, I need my paper making friends to help me here because the paper's disintegrating. These were heavily in cotton. I tried some with Abaca. It's a little bit better. I'm still having a lot of tearing. Not a total disaster, but something I'm working with. And I think I'm going to flip the paper the long way the next time I make a pattern. And finally, this is what I've had in my mind since day one, since I knew I was having this residency. I had this christening dress, which is on the left there. And it's long and it's narrow, and I wanted a long, narrow piece of paper. I wanted a decal that went all the way around the edge. I didn't want to have to tear paper down to the right size. And so I needed to make paper that was 2 foot by 3 foot. And so thanks to the Morgan, thanks to Tom, thanks to the staff down here that helped me with this. Ryan helped me build this box. I built my own deco box to create a paper for this. I also have, by the way, a corresponding dress of mourning that matches, that's also long and narrow, which will become another drawing. These are sketches for that print. This is a woodblock print that I have in mind. So these are sketches for what that might be. I've created both the wide paper, and you notice the pink one's a little narrower paper. I've created some narrower pieces by making an insert into my deco box. So I can do that. This is a couple sketches of the morning dress. Here it is in process. The deco box with the water in it. After I pulled the sheet, the pulp is settling. And then this is after I put the sheet out, ready to go into the dry box. So you can see I now have my 2 by 3 foot, or my 1 by 3 foot sheets of paper. And then back to the little prints with the little shards of paper. I wanted the bottom of that paper to just sort of fade away like it was an accident. So I did some full sheets, but then I played with sort of picking away at the paper at the bottom. In the slide on the left, you'll see I took just a fork and kind of pulled away pulp, something I learned in Nicole's workshop. And then I started taking the pulp and I'd lean it up and I'd take the hose and I'd spray a little bit of the pulp away at the bottom to create this very fragile bottom on the piece at the right. There's about 48 sheets of those either in the dry box or waiting to go in the dry box. I can't show them to you today. I haven't seen them, so we don't know if they're successful or not. But that sort of brings my journey here to a conclusion. I want to say thank you to the Morgan. It's been great. Thank you to all the staff here. You've been wonderful. They're so willing to help. Or they come back and they just give you encouragement. Hetty comes in the mornings and says, how's it going back here? And just starts my day off with a great smile. It's just a terrific program. I'm so happy to have had this opportunity. I want to thank my wife in the back of the room. She sees the other half of this. I'm down here having a great time. When I'm home, I'm not sure I'm quite the happy guy I am when I'm down here, especially during these last 3 weeks, but she's put up with that. Thank you, Sue. And then I have to stop by saying thank you to the Wingate Foundation, because I spent my entire career raising money so artists could have opportunities. And it is so wonderful to be on this side of that coin now and to have that opportunity. So thank you all. Appreciate it.